All right, folks, it is 3 o'clock on the dot. So why don't we get started so we can begin this webinar, get you back to your day. I'm going to stop screen sharing here for a moment and do some introductions briefly, if you'll bear with me. My name is Martin Daly. I'm the Director of Water Quality Programs for CDRPC, and welcome to today's webinar. Our webinar today is MS4 Stormwater Program, SPDES General Permit and SWPPP requirements for Planning Board review of subdivision and site plan projects. Quite a mouthful, and if you're unfamiliar with some of those terms, you're in the right place because we're going to teach you about them and the impact that they have on the plan review process for folks that are on the planning board. For those of you that don't know us, CDRPC is a regional planning and resource center that serves Albany, Rensselaer, Saratoga, and Schenectady counties. We foster intergovernmental cooperation, communicating, collaborating, and facilitating regional initiatives. We established this webinar series to help planners sharpen their skills and as a vehicle for Planning and Zoning Board of Appeals members to obtain credit hours. On that note, Planning and Zoning Board of Appeals members are required by state statute to obtain 4 hours of training a year, and municipalities have a wide latitude in defining what training is acceptable for credit. After each webinar in the series, each attendee that registered with an email address will receive an email. So if you don't get it, make sure to check your junk mail. Sometimes it ends up there. This email will confirm your attendance, and it is being sent in lieu of a formal certificate. That email can be presented to your municipality for consideration of credit. For practicing AICP planners, we have submitted this session for 1 hour of CM credit to the APA. So you can log on the website and use just the general word search, and you'll be able to find this and get the number for this session. A few housekeeping notes. Our attendees join with video and audio off for security purposes, but this does not mean that you're unable to ask questions or participate. We encourage you to do so, but please use the chat function or ask question function. That'll be the button at the bottom of your Zoom screen controls. I'll be moderating and interjecting from time to time with your questions, kind of like a radio DJ. Our presentations will be archived as PDF, and it is being recorded. The links to these materials will be on the Eventbrite website from which you used to register for the series. That usually takes a day for the video to process, and we post it to YouTube. So that access, in case you missed something or wanted to review a slide, that information will be available on the Eventbrite page. You're certainly welcome to email me if you miss getting a copy of it or you need help finding it. Today's webinar topic is MS4 Stormwater Program, SPDES General Permit, and SWPPP requirements for Planning Board review of subdivision and site plan projects. This presentation will provide an overview of required stormwater management rules and practices related to and for Planning Board project review and approval process. MS4s, which are municipal separate storm sewer systems, MS4 communities are required to enforce New York State DEC general permit provisions for development projects that will disturb at least an acre of land, and in some cases, much less than that threshold. Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plans, or what we call SWPPPs, and weekly inspections during construction are required for projects that meet the threshold in New York State. A summary of the SWPPP requirements, construction phase stormwater management practices, and project closeout will also be presented. We are very fortunate to be joined today by Tim Wales. He's an engineer and he's Chief Water Resources for the MRP Group. And I do want to thank Tim and the MRP Group for their sponsorship of this webinar series and coming to us to present today. Their sponsorship helps keep the cost of this webinar series affordable for those folks that are participating. With that note, I do want to encourage people, we're always modifying and adding to the webinar series. So just go to the Eventbrite page, see what new offerings have been posted. We'll be running the series through December, and we encourage you to sign up for those. I see Tim has begun his screen share, and he is getting ready. So I'm going to turn it over to him to begin. I know he's got a lot of material to cover. Again, if you want to ask a question, please do. Use the chat function, and I'll relay that over to Tim.
All right, great, Martin. Well, thanks so much for having me. Just a little bit about me. I'm a professional civil engineer, over 30 years of experience both on the private consulting side, and I was also the city engineer of Saratoga Springs for about 8.5 years. During that time, I was the stormwater management officer for the city, and I had overview of the city's MS4 compliance with the SPDES General Permit for MS4s, and as well as these SPDES General Permit for stormwater discharge during construction. During my time there, our program was audited by both the DEC and the EPA, and took the city through both of those very successfully. So that's just a little about me. All right, so just briefly, I'm going to talk about today kind of an overview of how stormwater relates to the planning board process and applications. For that, I'm going to formulate a little explanation of the environmental requirements in the MS4 program, why we take stormwater so seriously, and what MS4s are required to do. So we'll go through that and see how it relates to the planning board review process. We'll talk about the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plans, or SWPPs, which are a very important document for applicable sites for development. I'm going to talk about some of the post-construction stormwater management practices that are employed by developers on sites to ensure that stormwater is properly managed. And we'll talk about some best management practices for green infrastructure and how those can be sustainable practices, environmentally friendly. So, all right, well, I'll get right into it here. Well, by the way, this is kind of a broad overview. It's a lot of information and topics. I'm not really going to get into the detailed design of stormwater management practices too much, but there's a lot of great information out there on the DEC website about that. So, all right, just a little bit about the history of stormwater regulatory requirements. Started in the 1948 original Clean Water Act, established a structure to regulate pollutants and establish some water quality standards. 1972 came along with a big amendment and established that it's unlawful to discharge any point source pollutant into a navigable waterway without a permit. Point source being outfall pipe going into a river or something like that. Non-point source pollution is like stormwater runoff, sheet flow, or things like that, agricultural field runoff, where it doesn't come out of a pipe, essentially. 1987, further amendments to the Clean Water Act were promulgated. This established a phased approach to address water quality degradation caused by stormwater, and that also addressed some of the non-point source pollution. So the Phase 1 stormwater rules were established in 1990 and established the NYSDEC system, the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. Established the base unit of the MS4 program, and that was to mitigate high-level pollution in urban storm flow. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. At that time, there's a national permit system controlling medium and large populations. You can see medium defined as 100,000 to 250,000 people roughly, and large over 250,000 people in municipalities. And construction sites over 5 acres at the time. Also established the oversight hierarchy. The EPA promulgates these regulations, responsible for Clean Water Act. They delegated this program to the states, and not every state, but New York State is delegated state. So the MS4 and the stormwater program is overseen by the state Department of Environmental Conservation. So instead of NYSDES, we call it SPDES. And they delegate to MS4 communities, which are county and local organizations that are in charge of their stormwater programs. Well, an MS4 basically is or MS4 system is a conveyance or system of conveyances, including roads, drainage systems, streets, catch basins, curbs, gutters, any other conveyance media or storm drains owned or operated by municipality in the United States or state, town, county, district association, or other public body that discharges to waters of the United States or waters of the state that is designed for collecting and conveying stormwater. So then the Phase 2 stormwater rules came along in 2003, and this is an update. So this now encompassed regulation of the smaller communities, let's say under 100,000 people. Small is defined as any MS4 not already covered by the Phase 1 requirements. These requirements are density dependent, generally 1,000 people per square mile and above. Part of a larger continuous or contiguous urbanized area, and that even if that crosses over municipal and county boundaries. So this dropped the construction project threshold for review to an acre or more. That was 5 acres before under phase 1. So a little bit about the SPDES program in New York State. As I mentioned, the EPA delegates administration of the program to the DEC. There's 3 permits under the SPDES program: the general permit for construction activity, the general permit for municipal separate storm sewer systems, the MS4, and the general permit for stormwater discharges associated with industrial activity. So, those are the most recent permit numbers. The MS4 permit it's actually expired in 2015, and they're still waiting for the DEC to release updates to that permit. But so we're functioning under the 2015 permit still. The 3 categories of MS4s, traditional MS4s is land use control, and that applies to MS4s and most of what I'm going to talk about today, and municipalities that have planning boards and things like that to control land use. There's also some MS4s without land use control, such as a county agency, and they do things a little differently. They don't have the SWIP review and sign-off authority. There's also non-traditional MS4s, such as state agencies, counties, airports, colleges, schools, post offices, things like that, military, water and sewer, and special districts. But we're going to focus on the traditional MS4, the land use control. So just to kind of give you an overview of why municipalities regulate stormwater review, construction, and things like that. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the MS4 program overall. So if you are an MS4 municipality, and I can tell you the city of Saratoga Springs is, where I was city engineer, you have to implement a stormwater management program. And you have a big document we call a SWMP, and that kind of talks about all the things you do to manage stormwater. That SWMP will contain 6 minimum control measures, which I'll go over in a minute. There's 6 program areas that you have to be in compliance with. It helps you utilize approved best management practices for stormwater management, both during construction and post-construction. And you have to implement the program to the maximum extent practicable. You also, as part of that, designate a stormwater management officer, and that person can be a technical staff, such as me. It can be an elected official or a non-elected official, someone who can oversee the stormwater management program and sign off on the SWMP and other things for the municipality. So I just want to go over the 6 minimum control measures that are required in the SPDES General Permit for MS4s that municipalities have to comply with. The first is a public education and outreach program. You have to make your SWMP and the things you're doing available, and you have to have public meetings and let people know what you're doing. Second minimum control is active participation and involvement that you want. Once you publish your plan, you allow review and citizen input. The third minimum control is control of illicit discharges and detection of those. Obviously, those can be point source and non-point source areas. In the city of Saratoga Springs, we had over 80 stormwater outfalls, and we had to keep track of those and provide mapping for all those, and make provision to detect any illicit discharges by sampling and other means. The fourth minimum control measure deals with construction site runoff, which allows the municipalities the authority to regulate sites during construction. And number 5 is post-construction stormwater management, which we'll talk about, that deals with sites that have stormwater management measures that are in effect after construction is completed. And the last one is pollution prevention and good housekeeping. That applies, for instance, to the public works garage, best management practices for keeping oils and other things out of storm drains, and making sure you have good housekeeping. So Of these, we're going to talk about two today that are of particular interest for municipal officials and planning board review folks and technical folks, and that's minimum control measures number 4 and number 5. So number 5 deals with construction site runoff. So minimum control measure number 4 requires municipalities to develop, implement, and enforce a program that provides equivalent protection to the SPDES General Permit for stormwater discharges from construction, addresses a stormwater runoff from construction activities that result in a land disturbance of 1 acre or more. And that threshold can change based on local law for municipalities. In the city of Saratoga Springs, they established a local law that non-residential projects of 1/10 of an acre or more had to do SWIP and were regulated as such. That's kind of unusual. Saratoga Springs is a larger municipality. Many of the towns, villages around would not have such a local law. It's also important to note over 5 acres, residential projects apply if they are 5 acres or more for a full SWIP. And we'll talk about that a little bit. So anyway, going ahead, we have to enact and implement regulatory mechanisms to require SWIP and erosion sediment controls for applicable sites. And by regulatory mechanisms, that means the municipality has to, in their codes, have rules and regulations for stormwater, especially in their site plan, subdivision, and other regulations. That has to be right in the municipal code. Describes a process for review of SWIPs and procedures for inspection and enforcement of the stormwater provisions. So minimum control measure number 5 deals mostly with the post-construction stormwater management. A lot of the same rules. The municipality has to enact laws or regulatory mechanisms to allow them to regulate stormwater practices after a site is fully constructed. Same rules apply for the thresholds for 1 acre or more. These can be structural and non-structural management practices. Describes a process for SWIP review, and it requires a municipality to maintain inventories of post-construction stormwater management practices, at least since the Phase 2 rules were promulgated in 2003, which is interesting to think about it. So every year, sites develop that are required to have post-construction stormwater management practices, and municipalities required to keep track of those. So how do you do that after a subdivision or something that developers left, or a shopping center? So what that forced municipalities to do is add a provision to the SWIP, making developers inspect their post-construction stormwater management practice yearly and submit a report. Otherwise, the municipality has to go and inspect all these systems every year and make sure they're operating. So that's kind of a point of contention that the city of Saratoga Springs went through when we dealt with the EPA audit. All right, so let's talk about stormwater management a little bit here. With 3 overall goals. We want to satisfy the water quality requirements of the Clean Water Act for non-point source pollution. We want to reduce pollutant discharge to the maximum extent practicable. And overall, we want to protect the local water quality. And why do we want to do that? Well, there are drawbacks by not doing that. As you can see, the impacts of increasing imperviousness by developed sites with no regulation of stormwater, or very little regulation of stormwater, and just going out and making parking lots and things like that. Well, impervious surfaces have stormwater that has to go somewhere. And so here's a few pictures of what happens when we're not diligent about stormwater review. So here's some of the drawbacks, or the things can happen. Impacts of stormwater can be pollution. You see sediment loss from these are construction sites or even non-construction sites. Solid waste pollution can be carried through our stormwater collection systems and discharged to our waterways. And examples of non-point source pollution can be particularly dangerous are runoff from agricultural fields, runoff from roads and areas with highway maintenance or vehicle maintenance, things like that. Also, you've probably heard of outbreaks of red tide and other things in the ocean, which are often caused by pollution, agricultural runoff. Another thing is erosion. Here's a good picture of a stream that flooded and some erosion here. So what's going on with all this? We have really two competing things that are exacerbating our stormwater management and really make it important that we pay close attention. And when projects come and they're applicable, meet the threshold for review, it's important that we review those thoroughly and make sure the standards are followed. Why? Because the first part of this is climate change. As many of you know, we're seeing increase in rain and more severe rain events with higher intensity, shorter duration. You can see the increase in the extreme events, the 100-year storm, to as frequently as 10 to 22 years. And sprawling development. The development patterns tending towards larger lots with lower density residential, so they're spread out more. Standalone commercial retail. In those cases, 50% more land is consumed. There's less green space, more lawns, roads, parking lots that are susceptible to runoff. But we still rely a lot on the gray versus green infrastructure to deal with our stormwater. Gray being stormwater pipes and hard infrastructure to convey discharge runoff. We're seeing a greater frequency of extreme weather events. You can see our yearly flooding events are going up. Average floods 1960, 1980 were 2.1 a year, and now that's over 5, 1980 to 2010. So here's some more pictures of what happens. We experience extreme weather events, high intensity, short duration weather events. That's the Northway in 2005, and that's the Stockade section of Schenectady in 2011, I believe it was. Yeah, and here's some overland flooding around that area. There's another picture down in Windham, which down that way in Square County, Delaware County, experienced severe flooding issues during Hurricane Irene. Here's the Hudson River. Now, this is interesting because it's I believe this is a normal snowmelt year, although it's a rapidly intensive stormwater and warming. The temperatures are very warm that spring. So the normal flood stage at the Hudson River is 10 feet, and that was 13.25 feet in spring of 2011. All right, so how does this impact us for reviews of SWPPPs and projects, development projects in terms of stormwater? We want to ensure the land use board has a review authority. That's up to the MS4 to give you the power to do that. We want to ensure the SWPPP provisions for erosion sediment control during construction are followed. And we want to ensure provisions for post-construction, stormwater management practices and O&M are followed. Talk a little bit more about this. I'm just going to give a brief overview of the planning board review process. Again, I was the city engineer of Saratoga Springs for over 8 years, and this is kind of the process we followed. Some of the processes of villages and towns and other municipalities may vary a little bit, but anyway, to go through the pre-application meeting, often the developer and their consultants would meet with the planners, the municipality, not always, but more significant projects, always a good idea. The application would be submitted for site plan or subdivision or other land use applications. An initial review for completeness would occur, and that application would include forms and fees, environmental quality review forms, complete streets, other things that are required by municipalities, engineering reports, and then drawings. And drawings set for subdivision or site plan would generally have a survey, erosion sediment control plans, grading and drainage plans, layout of the proposed buildings, utility plans, water, sewer, landscape and lighting, and details. And they would also include a stormwater pollution prevention control if it was a project meeting the thresholds for review. Technical review, again, occurs in Saratoga Springs. Once a project was deemed complete, it was desired to get the project reviewed and on the planning board agenda within 30 days. So it's reviewed by the planning and zoning staff, the engineering staff, or town designated engineers. This stormwater management officer will ensure that the SWPPP is reviewed properly. Often building departments, code enforcement, public safety would review SWPPPs. Public works and utilities departments would want to take a look often to see how water and sewer are impacted, impacts in the right of way, things like that. And also county planning departments, NYSDEC State Historic Preservation Office at times will review projects if it impacts their operations or lands. Generally, we get preliminary comments back from the technical reviews. Then the application is scheduled for a planning board meeting, often with a presentation. Once that's deemed acceptable, approved, the seeker process is complete. Final technical comments are addressed. A final set of plans are submitted. The municipality, if it's a project applicable, would sign off on the SWIP acceptance form, which is a required form to make sure SWIPs are properly reviewed, and the plans get signed. In the case of Saratoga Springs, the planning board chair would sign every sheet of the plans. So let's talk about the SWIP for a little bit. SWIPs are a site-specific strategy for erosion sediment control during construction, and it outlines best management practices, good housekeeping, such as stone construction entrances, silt fence, other measures to keep sediment on the site during construction until it's properly stabilized. It's a site-specific strategy for post-construction stormwater management as well. It talks about what the permanent measures will be for stormwater management of rainwater that hits the impervious surfaces and collected, and what happens to that water. As I mentioned before, a full SWIP is required for an acre or more of non-residential disturbance. Partial SWIP or an erosion sediment control plan for 1 to 5 acres of residential disturbance. As I mentioned, a local law can be more strict than the DC rules. In the case of the city of Saratoga Springs, for non-residential projects, the threshold was 1/10 of an acre for a full SWIP. So the contents of the SWIP roughly kind of talks about and shows plans of the existing and the proposed site design, provisions for erosion sediment control, such as some of the measures I mentioned. It talks about best management practices and housekeeping, site maintenance. If stone construction entrances get full of sediment, it says that the contractor has to replace that to keep sediment out of the road. And they have to model a pre and post development runoff and water quality conditions and demonstrate the runoff reduction volume and the water quality, quality reductions. And those are an important part of the calculations to determine the runoff that will occur and how they're going to handle that runoff. Talks about the post-construction stormwater management practices that will handle the stormwater once the site is fully developed and stabilized, and how they're going to operate. And it also has to have an operation and maintenance plan to talk about how those practices will be maintained over time. So we'll talk a little bit about green infrastructure and planning measures. So in order to handle our development and our runoff, we want to look at the green infrastructure ways and things and how they work to be able to allow the site to function without violating the DC stormwater regulations. So one of the first things you want to do is develop a map and look at all the natural resource areas and drainage patterns. And this is one of the first things a consultant wants to look for in the design process. They want to map out where the wetlands and waterways, existing buffers such as streams, forests, floodplains, vegetative cover, critical areas, topography certainly, soil and hydrologic soil groups are very important, as do the slopes, depth of bedrock. All those things affect the design of the site. One of the application pages will look like this. These are best management practices that may be employed on a particular site. Some bioretention, and this is during construction. Stormwater inlet, various methods to collect stormwater. There's an overflow from a stormwater management pond they have here, and those are some of the things that would be reviewed for stormwater management on a plan submitted. All right, so once we've submitted our plans and got everything approved, then the construction process can start. So as I mentioned, the final comments are addressed, the plans are signed, the stormwater management official accepts the SWIP and signs a notice of intent, and a pre-construction meeting is held. And this is required under the MS4 rules. During that pre-construction meeting, the stormwater management officer or other official overseeing construction of applicable sites will go through some of the rules and requirements for construction, notifications, review the SWIP provisions and requirements, weekly inspections that are required. We'll talk about that in a minute. Site stabilization and the notice of termination, and as-built drawings and letters of credit, and other things that happen to be able to release the site. And maintenance inspection of post-construction stormwater management practices as well. So these are things generally a municipality will go over during the pre-construction meeting. All right, so just some more SWPPP requirements during construction. Municipality or their design consultant or someone has to perform weekly inspections during construction to make sure sediment is properly managed and stormwater is accounted for. It's a verified compliance with the stormwater permit and the criteria of the MS4. Once the project is completed and the site stabilized, the municipality signs off on the notice of termination, which is a completion of construction, and that says that the site is grown in and stabilized, any post-construction stormwater management practices are in place, and the site is functioning properly. And there's a little example of some of the questions that an inspector looks for and checks off during weekly site inspections. So this is just some pictures of what happens if a site is not properly stabilized during construction. This is a clearing and construction site. And you can see the photograph on the left shows a stone construction entrance. It was not properly constructed. I don't see much silt fence around, a little bit of silt fence, a lot of brush and things piled up. This site was not properly stabilized, got a storm event. Obviously, you can see some erosion gullies happening to the access road. All right, so let's talk about some post-construction stormwater management practices. And we talk about them because these are things you want to think about during the review process. Whether you are a technical reviewer or a planning board official, we'll go over some of these things, why we have the post-construction management practices and things you may want to think about or learn more about during the actual review process of the SWPPP and the application. So what's a post-construction stormwater management practice? Well, it's a permanent engineered practice that can reduce the impact of stormwater from a developed site on the environment. It can show the ways that stormwater is going to be mitigated from all the impervious surfaces and how that is mitigated to the pre-development runoff levels. There's a DEC as the Stormwater Management Design Manual. So design practices that are used in stormwater management must be the ones that are approved by the DEC. And again, the state and local law sometimes governs this. They may have their own standard details, and their own regulations, as we mentioned. What are we trying to do post-construction? Well, we want to manage our water quality. We want to be handle the water for the 90th percentile event, or 0.9 inches per hour in our region. That's what you have to handle with your proposed stormwater management practices. And we want to manage the water quantity. We want to manage how much water we're getting and look at how our stormwater management practices will work during the 1, 10, 100-year events. Just a note that redevelopment projects and your calculations, you get a little bit of a break. You only consider 75% versus 100% of the water quality volume and runoff rates. So. All right, so possible exceptions to the rule when you're a designer is you can't use green infrastructure practices, or kind of the standard stormwater management practices include sites with high groundwater, shallow bedrock, impermeable soils, steep slopes, and karst geology and limestone. Those are sites that present problems for stormwater management practices to keep stormwater on the site, infiltrating and managed. All right, so when we look at these, here are 2 areas of impact with stormwater runoff from sites. Obviously, impervious surface creates flooding, steam degradation, habitat loss, stress on infrastructure, as we mentioned, and a lot of the pollutants there. We saw some of them in the pictures everywhere from sediment, obviously. Phosphorus is very important for streams and runoff, fertilizers, agricultural waste, toxins, bacteria, the whole list of things that can be susceptible to runoff if sites are not managed properly. So we want to reduce our runoff. There are 5 pathways to think about that during design of a SWPPP. That's minimize your building footprints, as small as possible, as dense as possible. Minimize impervious surfaces with parking lots, sidewalks, with alternative porous materials. We'll talk about that. Reductions in area, the total disturbed area, or designated areas to a single practice. Impervious disconnection. In other words, we want to go gray infrastructure to green infrastructure, which gray again meaning pipes, to green not gray infrastructure to gray infrastructure, meaning send it to the municipality through the storm system, or green infrastructure to gray infrastructure, which we don't want to do that. So, and source control treatment. This is we want to be able to treat our things on site with the best practices available. One of the things we can do, as I mentioned, area reduction. We want to minimize impervious surfaces. Obviously, a lot of it, solid surface areas can create a lot of stormwater. We want to minimize roadways, sidewalks, driveways, and parking lots, and consider porous materials. We'll talk a little bit about porous asphalt, minimize building footprints. In their calculations, you get credits for area reductions. So when we're calculating, or the consultant's calculating our water quality values and what we're going to do to manage the stormwater, we want to consider preservation of natural areas. We need to consider the sheet flow to buffers, areas, and strips to be able to keep stormwater from getting off the project. Tree plantings, rooftop disconnection, and as we said there, you get credit for trees and plantings. Rooftop disconnection means that you don't want to have your roof gutters go directly to storm service or impervious surfaces. And yes, the trees are counted for credits for water quality volume reduction. We want to preserve our natural areas again. If there are sites that were there pre-development, we want to preserve them as much as we can and keep those as a significant part of the site. And they can be buffer areas and really advantages for development of sites. So in other words, we want to do smart planning when we're developing sites, and these are things to look for when you're reviewing planning board applications and land use board applications. Where does the planning start? We want to consider this stuff early on, not as an afterthought. With proper planning and design, a project can avoid creating the impacts at the outset. We can minimize the impacts that are unavoidable and then the impervious surfaces that we are forced to use. And we're going to mitigate those impacts using green infrastructure. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So we're going to talk about, again, with our post-construction stormwater management practices using green infrastructure. When we do this, using green infrastructure, we can reduce the runoff, volume, peak flow, duration of flow, slow the flow, and increase the time of concentration, which is how long water takes to get from point A to point B. We'll promote infiltration that can improve groundwater recharge, protect downstream water resources. We can reduce flooding, property damage, reduce incidence of combined sewer overflows from municipalities that have combined sewers, which is the sanitary and the storm together. Reduce treatment costs of those waters, even reduce thermal pollution, and improve habitat for wildlife. The New York State Design Manual for Stormwater Management, as I mentioned before, has several types of green infrastructure practices for site mitigation, including ponds, filtration, open channels and swales, infiltration, wetlands. And we're going to look at some of these now. There's also some alternative practices that are discussed in the Stormwater Design Manual, and these are encouraged. These can be rain gardens, which are my favorite, green roofs, planter boxes, porous asphalt, and rain barrels. Those are kind of some of the unique things and the alternative things that make it a little interesting. So let's define green infrastructure. My definition is a strategically planned and managed networks of natural lands, working landscapes, and other open spaces that can serve ecosystem values and functions and provide associated benefits to human populations. All right. So there's some examples of things we're going to talk about: some rain gardens, open space, ponds, green roofs, and wetland areas. All right. So again, why do we want to do this? We want to use green infrastructure for runoff reduction. And as we review applications, we want to look for that, look for the design consultant or engineer, and see what is employed to reduce runoff from his site. We want to ensure the SWPPP provisions and requirements for post-construction stormwater management practices are met. And that's the intent of the MS4. That's why the regulations, to ensure that that happens. So here's some of the things we can do to reduce runoff. When we look at a site, or consultants look at a site, and planning board members and others want to think about as you're reviewing plans or think about stormwater. First is conservation of natural areas in our project. We want to reduce runoff, treatment volume, saves cost and possible land consumption, provides permanent protection and open space, can add really aesthetic values to the site as well. Increase property values, and promotes protection of natural hydrologic balance and maintains pre-developed groundwater recharge characteristics. So if you have natural areas, conservation areas like that on a site, or they can be employed, they're very valuable for reducing runoff. We want to employ buffer protection of natural areas such as wetlands. Important part of buffer areas are signs and protection. You can see some construction fences and things like that. If there's a wetland employed or other natural area, they need to be clearly demarcated, especially at the borders of residential areas and subdivisions, because generally if those signs are not there and they're not completely marked, they will often be encroached upon by individual residents, folks, or developers, or what have you. So signs and demarcation and protection of these areas are important. Well, here's another thing we can do: sheet flow to bioretention buffers and filter strips. Can use to filter and infiltrate stormwater runoff from our impervious surfaces, provide a valuable corridor for protection of stream and wetland and shoreline habitats. We can reduce the runoff volume, saves cost and land consumption. We can incorporate these bioretentions and buffers, filter strips, promotes protection again of natural hydrologic balance, maintains pre-developed groundwater recharge, reduces pollutant load delivery as well to receiving waters. Here's some bioretention areas, some buffer strips. You can see how here runoff from streets can be directed towards these treatment areas, whether it's rain gardens, biofiltration, natural areas, and the like. Here's some green street ideas, same thing. If you have a new subdivision with streets, these can be employed pretty readily to reduce the amount of runoff from new streets and impervious surfaces, and even sidewalks and things like that. So you can use vegetated swales. These reduce the cost of roads, stormwater conveyance, and construction, provide some runoff storage and infiltration, as well as treatment. Post-development discharges are used to calculate quantity controls, will likely be lower due to the slightly longer time of concentration for the site. In other words, using these things, it takes longer for stormwater to get through these things and eventually impact areas off-site or go to areas of gray infrastructure. And these can vary from wet and dry swales. In the design process, vegetated swales can be very valuable for your the consultant's calculation and the amount of stormwater he has to handle. Here's some examples of open swales and biofiltrations, other types of things. Some ponds here, some constructed wetlands, and other good things. Another great way to reduce runoff is trees. Trees have tremendous benefits for the urban atmosphere, buffers wind and noise, increases nutrient uptake, and lots of good things to consider. So there are also air conditioners. They improve air quality, and they can provide habitat. Tree trenches are another engineered way to handle stormwater. You see some examples here of trenches under construction, and when finished, tree belts are very attractive and aesthetically pleasing and provide a lot of benefits, as well as reduce runoff. Rooftop disconnections. As I mentioned before, we're not just dumping our roof runoff down a gutter into a stormwater collection area or road or parking lot or what have you. If we can use vegetative and impervious areas, we can filter and infiltrate runoff, increase water quality. Green daylighting, I believe that's a picture from San Antonio, where the stream can be used in the natural area, and these can collect stormwater and improve aesthetic quality, improve water quality, increase habitat, wildlife value, property values, and the aesthetic appeal. Rain gardens, one of my favorites. So we'll talk a little bit about rain gardens. Rain gardens are great. They're great for pollutant retention, treatment from rooftops, driveways. They're great for groundwater recharge. They provide a micro-scale habitat. They can be a really great aesthetic improvement to turf grass or other hard urban surfaces. They're not crazy to maintain as long as you have the right vegetation for the right planting zone. They require a small amount of land area. Here's some examples of some really aesthetically attractive rain gardens. All right, here's some other great ones. Plantings for rain gardens are very important. You want to pick plantings that will survive and for your zone, and we'll come back year after year and thicken and keep managing stormwater for years to come. Biotic variations on rain gardens and things like that. You got perennial gardens, perennial shrubs, trees and turfs and things like that. So, and here's some more examples of sustainable practices, the rain gardens, things like that. So there's all kinds of ways to make a rain garden make a difference on stormwater management, from, again, parking lots, sidewalks, other impervious surfaces. Green roofs, another great way, a little more expensive, but that can reduce total annual runoff volumes. A little more maintenance, and a green roof, obviously, as other considerations, can regulate building temperatures and insulation from heat. Green roofs can extend the life of a standard roof by as long as 20 years, provide UV protection. Green roofs can be designed to insulate the building from noise, sound-absorbing properties, can make areas quieter. Green roofs can provide fire resistance and inhibit spread of fire, and it can reduce urban heat. All right, so there's also some really good benefits of green roofs in here. And all right, so just show some pictures of green roofs. Examples, some good examples here. All right, the next great way to reduce runoff from the site is stormwater planters. The site's not suitable for other infiltration flow-through technologies. Stormwater planters can be a good thing to use, or reduce stormwater discharge volumes, velocities. Flow-through planters or contained planters, they don't require a setback. They can be strategically placed around the site for engineering purposes, but also for aesthetic and natural environment purposes. There are some examples of some great stormwater planters in the urban landscape. These can be utilized in a subdivision or commercial sites, or even in the right-of-way. All right, some other good ideas: rain barrels, cisterns, store runoff or from roofs and things like that, reduce transported pollutants, reduce water consumption, and use great retrofits in urban redevelopment scenarios. Right? We don't have enough land to do a lot of other practices. So there's some examples: some rain barrels, some cisterns, even water recycling. Lastly is also one of my favorites, porous pavement. Porous pavement is a great way to reduce runoff from actual asphalt areas, building frontage areas with, you can see some porous pavers. It's a great treatment for solids, metals. It's an aesthetic improvement. And there's lots more and more examples of use of porous pavements and asphalt on regular roads. In Lake George, $1 Million Beach Road a couple of years ago was constructed with porous pavements. With porous pavements, a very detailed construction requirements. You have to use the right mix of asphalt. You have to put down at specific temperatures. The inspection requirements during construction can be pretty heavy for porous asphalt. But once it's down, it can make a huge difference in runoff reduction. Here's some examples of some porous pavements and pavers that can be used on the roadways, driveways, walkways, things like that. So that about wraps it up. Just some conclusions for planning board members or other people involved in stormwater management. Hope today we've given you a little bit of familiarity with the MS4 program and the requirements, and you can understand the basis and importance of the stormwater review during the planning process, and what's important, what to look for, and potentially some of the impacts if we don't pay attention. A little bit of familiarity with the design process, hopefully, and post-construction stormwater management practices. If you are a plan reviewer or someone who's creating plans, a consultant. We want to use all the tools available to minimize the impact of development on water quality, not just to meet the regulations, but to make benefit of all the different things that green infrastructure and really innovative post-construction management practices can offer. And you want to encourage sustainability and green infrastructure practices and planning board projects. At the end of the day, what we want to do, we want to balance development with the environment. So just a few ways, good examples here that's been done. So that is about it today.
Tim, I want to thank you for an exhaustive presentation. I had a couple of questions I wanted to throw at you. You covered a lot of ground, and I realize
yes,
one of these subject areas could be its own presentation. There's a lot
yes,
of stormwater design and planning and site management, both in the construction and the post-construction sides. I guess from an experience perspective, from your time representing the city of Saratoga Springs, what were some of the best practices that a developer or their consulting engineer would employ to be able to work with the city early on to ensure that they were able to navigate the process and everybody kind of walked away feeling like they had been heard throughout the process?
Yeah, I would think upon working with the planners and review all the projects for that time, one of the most important things is pre-application meetings or communication early on. We'd often have applicants come and meet with the planners and myself often for technical questions and what they think would work for sites. The city of Saratoga Springs was very good because it's very sandy, and we had really good atmosphere for infiltration. Infiltration, obviously, is a green infrastructure practice. I noticed that a lot of times that some consultants and developers would want to keep costs low and kind of do the minimum. And with pretty good infiltration of our soils, that was often easy. But we were finding we're always trying to encourage more innovative and green infrastructure practices. Some of the challenges with that is the maintenance, even with rain gardens and things like that. You have to pay a little bit of attention to those. So I think in Saratoga, the city of Saratoga Springs, most of it was most of our developers. I think it was a pretty smooth process as long as they communicated and came and met with the planners and followed the regulations, and it was a pretty good process.
Now, coming from I'm on a board of zoning appeals myself, and I'm fortunate I have a background in planning, but as you're aware, planning and zoning boards aren't required for backgrounds in this, and oftentimes they're a good cross spectrum of representation in the community. So from your experience as an engineer, you have a detailed knowledge of these types of practices and performance standards. Are there things that you wish every planning board member or zoning board member would really sharpen their pencil on and be able to understand to bring to the table when they're reviewing a project?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'm really big on the kind of the more innovative green infrastructure practices. I get very involved with porous asphalt for driveways and subdivisions and roads, which is really a great practice. Rain gardens is always a favorite of mine. And not only rain gardens are a great way to get stormwater off the impervious surfaces, provide treatment, but it's very aesthetically pleasing. So those things, that's something I would encourage someone to look for beyond, realizing the importance of these practices, but look for a little innovation and green infrastructure and aesthetics and things like that. In the old days, a lot of sites, big sites, you'll see wet ponds or dry ponds. You still see those out there. And I always think, wow, what a waste of land and things like that. And some developers want to stay very low tech and do those things. But I would look at the critical eye when somebody comes in with just infiltration or meets, the minimum standards and then, overflows the storm sewer, things like that. I encourage everyone to think about and maybe become familiar with a lot of the green infrastructure practices that can be employed by consultants and developers to really make their development sites very attractive and aesthetically pleasing as well as technically functional.
Okay. Thank you. We have a question from one of our attendees asking about how the regulations for stormwater management practices may differ in ag districts. I know that depending on the level of sophistication and what type of permit is in place for a community, for example, a rural community is subject to general permit only, but are there special considerations that that communities that have ag districts need to be keenly aware of when they're reviewing a site plan for a building?
I'm not, I'm very familiar with the city of Saratoga Springs and their requirements. Of course, we're a larger municipality for this area in MS4. I know that, the smaller municipalities, other municipalities don't have technical staff review, and maybe they don't have the wherewithal to hire a designated engineer for review of these. The review process is a lot less stringent depending on where you are. So I'm not as familiar with agricultural districts and things like that. One thing I neglected to mention, Blue Niels, the Saratoga County Stormwater Coordinator, is a wealth of information about all things stormwater, not just the MS4 program, but a lot of other programs. I put his contact information there, SaratogaStormwater.org, but also the DEC has a wealth of information on things, and I'm sure very quickly somebody could find out how the rules apply to their individual district or municipality.
Yeah, the DEC publishes a very handy chart, which I'll post after this session. I'll include it on our Eventbrite page to explain what permitted coverage is required for certain types of developments. The general rule of thumb for a community that doesn't have their own stormwater standards that apply to site development in smaller than an acre is that above an acre disturbance or more requires a stormwater management plan and permit coverage. That may be different in ag districts, although an acre size building would be quite considerable. But I will post that so people have access to some of those resources, and that may answer their questions to that level of specificity. It doesn't seem like we have any. Oh, I got one more in the question and answer function. The question is, if asphalt millings and gravel for parking areas, are they both considered impervious, and is one better than the other? Perhaps you give a little bit more detail about the specification when it comes to porous asphalt.
Yeah, well, a lot depends on the soils and the subsurface as well. I heard you say asphalt, gravel, and was there a third?
It was asphalt, millings, and gravel for parking areas. So they both considered impervious.
Yeah, millings. I think it depends on the design. Porous asphalt is very tricky. As I mentioned, you have to get the actual mix right in order to use it and have it work effectively. There's all kinds of variations. Even the temperature that it's put down can make a difference on whether it's functional or not. I think gravel is not a called an impervious surface, or it can be depending on the soils underneath. But millings, I think would be considered, depending on how they're installed, impervious, as would normal asphalt. You can get some credit for infiltration from gravel areas, but the engineer would have to calculate that. And again, it's not as easy an answer. This area is impervious and this one's not. It depends on a lot of things, including the soils, depth of bedrock. There's different classifications of soils on a site, but I know that all of them can be considered impervious if the design is right.
That's also something that's an important tip I think I'll pass on to folks that are interested. If you know your soils and you know what you have to work with on a particular site, you begin to understand the limitations, because no two sites are alike. Any engineer I ask to kind of give a thumb rule sketch will say, wait a minute, this is a very general overview, because no two sites are the same, even in urban areas where you may have pre-disturbance or urban fill and complicated soils. So we do have one.
Yeah, I just touched on sorry, excuse me, just a very basic design. There's so much to site design and stormwater, but as you can see, it can get very in depth. So just to keep it simple today.
Yeah. Are there general landscape maintenance requirements for green roofs that you've seen?
Well, certainly, everything has maintenance. A few years ago, one of the Bonaccio buildings in Saratoga Springs employed green roof, and when you have whatever practice you're using in your SWPPP, it has to have an operation and maintenance plan. Depending on the plants used, some plants, some green roofs can grow very slowly, depending on what kind of vegetation. Others have high maintenance. I think the designer has to be very careful what he's using for a green roof. Is he providing treatment, or is he simply providing some storage, or things like that. And interesting thing about one thing I forgot to mention, bioswales on your parking lots and rain gardens, you have to be very careful about snow plowing. So, so you can't pile snow into these things because all the sediment and everything. So there are a lot of operation and maintenance items for all the infrastructure practices that have to be carefully considered by the designer when they're completing a SWIP.
Yeah, there are a couple of examples of green roofs if folks want to check them out. I know one of them is at the Urban Growth Center in Troy. That's the facility that Capital Roots operates. They do, I know nothing is standard this day and age because of COVID, but they have in the past offered tours and opportunities to see how a multitude of green infrastructure practices work on that site in Troy. They used a planting mix that included what are called sedums, which are very low maintenance types of plants. And then also the University of Albany on their University Heights project in their main campus. And they also use the sedums mix on the roof of that building, which is a very resilient material that does not require a lot of maintenance. And generally for green roofs that are tough to access, those will be the types of plantings that are used. And there are only a couple of examples of green roofs in the Capital District, Doane Stewart being one of them, where they have actual access and they kind of use them as a living laboratory. Most are closed off to people to be able to utilize. So we do have a list at CDRPC on our website of green infrastructure practices in the Capital Region, and some that have actually employed green infrastructure. So if you actually just type in green infrastructure CDRPC into Google, you should be able to find that in the early list of results. And we do have some examples that people can look to from a lot of the practices Tim has mentioned: porous asphalt, bioswales, rain gardens, green roofs, cisterns, you name it. So Tim, I really want to thank you for sharing your expertise with us. You covered a lot of ground. It's kind of a scorched earth approach because there's so much material here. But I do want to appreciate your time, and I do want to thank all of our attendees for joining us this afternoon. Again, you are getting an email at the end of this presentation. If you don't get that email, let me know. Certainly reach out to us. We can work to make sure that you have a document that's sufficient to provide to your municipality in case you need it. So with that, thank you, Tim. Thank you, MRB, for your sponsorship. And hopefully everybody has a little bit of time to enjoy the remaining sunshine if we have any today. So
all right. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.